Hi, I'm Dan Reuter, Land Use Chief with the Atlanta Regional Commission. To understand Georgia history and decisions that led to our current infrastructure, patterns of growth, and economic progress, we have to consider the decisions made by state and community leaders at that time. During 2008, the American Planning Association funded a video project to interview key individuals discussing the events, stories, and the planning history that shaped Metro Atlanta and Georgia. The Georgia chapter of APA and the Atlanta Regional Commission co-produced the project. 10 people who were influential during key historical growth and planning events were selected for the project. Key topics included the rebirth of the City of Atlanta, Metro Atlanta regional plans, Georgia planning and zoning laws, key infrastructure such as the MARTA transit system, Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, and Buford Dam, and the creation of the Georgia chapter of APA. This one-hour documentary is only a summary of the full 12 hours of material captured for the project. Transcripts of the videos and the full video content itself are available through the Georgia Planning Association and ARC. The interviews included Paul Kellman, Jerry Griffin, William Allison, Harry West, David Kirk, Inga Kennedy, Leon Eplin, Tom Roberts, Tom Wyant, and Chick Krautler. We would also like to thank Tim Crimmins of Georgia State University, who provided funds for transcription services, and Lance Lipman of Video Assets, Inc., who served as the videographer and editor for the project. We hope you enjoy the video.
As we began to move from our initial planners into our first professional planner, we began to evolve a professional group coming out of Georgia Tech, which was established in 1948 or 46, 48, as one of the cities that was funded, one of the schools that was funded by the federal government and partly to begin to produce planners. But what occurred during this time, as we began to see programs develop, we began to see people who regarded themselves as a professional planner, not a landscape architect interested in planning or a health professional interested in planning, but people who were actually regarded themselves as a professional planner. And that evolved eventually into establishing and breaking apart those people who were interested in cities and those who are interested in professional planning and setting standards for defining what planning is all about. We kept going back and forth. We had two organizations. When I was coming along, I graduated from North Carolina in planning in 1950. When I came along, there was a professional society. In the South, we initially had three states, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, which had a professional organization of planners. That finally, when there became more and more planners in these states, we began to break out those three. I was president of the regional planning group, and then when we established a state chapter of American Institute of Planners, I became the first president, and that was in 1961 or 2, I forget where. And that's when we began to see professional planning being recognized as a worthy profession, and began to see standards set up and mentioned in legislation at the General Assembly.
You had these three organizations. You had AIP, which was professional planners in Washington. You had ASPO, which was all kinds of planning interested people in Chicago. And you had GPA, which had grown up in the meantime as a citizen-based organization in Georgia for planning board members and mayors and whatever. Then there was a movement to merge AIP, and these alphabet things got out of control, but to merge the American Institute of Planners and the American Society of Planning Officials. That had always been resisted in the past because the two organizations were national, had historic pride. They weren't going to be merged by somebody else. And whenever it was brought up, it never got it. It gets studied to death by what planners do, and they never come back and do it. Well, along about then, I was the recently departed executive director of AIP, so I had good feelings with those people. And I was also the president-elect of ASPO, which I'd just been elected, whose executive director was Israel Stallman, who was my boss back in Youngstown, so we'd been friends forever.
Early in my career, planning was more fragmented in terms of professional associations. At the national level, there was the American Institute of Planners and the American Society of Planning Officials. And probably sometime in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, those organizations got together to form the American Planning Association. And here in Georgia, we also had the Georgia chapter of the American Institute of Planners at one time, and we also had the Georgia Planning Association. The distinction between the two groups was that the Georgia chapter of AIP at the time was more professionals, and the Georgia Planning Association was more planning officials, so not necessarily planners. And an interesting tidbit there is that some of the original founders of the Georgia Planning Association was Jimmy Carter and Sam Nunn, who were involved in local government at the time in their respective counties, and they actually were some of the founding members of GPA. I served as president of what was then the Georgia chapter of AIP and APA, and we decided at the time that it made sense to merge the organization as much as the national organizations had merged. So during my tenure as chapter president, I was pleased to be able to pull that off, and we did merge and became the new Georgia Planning Association, which is the Georgia chapter of APA. So from the standpoint of professional organizations, that's my small contribution to the history of the organization.
When I came in, I kind of inherited working with the Georgia Planning Association. I think Jimmy Carter had been the first president of that group. He was chairman of his RDC down in Ellaville at the time. And so I got to work with the Georgia Planning Association way back there. And I can't recall the legislation, but if I remember correctly, even concepts like plan unit development came up during that period of time, and we worked to pass that, all of which was kind of new back in the early 70s. But again, I think planning rocked along, and of course, when Governor Carter came in, he had a strong planning background, very strong desire to do better planning, and of course, then he created the Goals for Georgia program that was headed by Sam Nunn, a young legislator from down in Houston County. And I was assigned to work with Sam Nunn on that project. GMA felt it was extremely important. It turned out, I think Governor Carter was using it largely as a way to build support for his state government reorganization, which he ultimately came. But again, it caused lots of examination of where we were in the state. And Sam Nunn did a phenomenal job on that. He traveled the state with groups of, quote, experts, holding town meetings and everything. And again, I think that report certainly pointed out some things in Georgia. And of course, Sam later used that to move on to higher and bigger things, and as did Governor Carter. So, I think that the people involved in early planning went on to much greater heights.
The first plan in 1952 recommended growth be concentrated in the city of Atlanta and in existing nodes that are already in place, like Decatur and Roswell and East Point, and that we should connect all of those nodes with adequate modern transportation. And no one liked it. The plan was just not acceptable to the community. And MPC was told to go back and try again. So 2 years later, they produced the second regional plan that basically said concentrate growth in the city of Atlanta and in concentric circles therefrom. So we began in 1954 planning the sprawl that we have today. So when people say, oh, the sprawl wasn't planned, I say wrong. Go back and look at the 54 plan. But we still could have made changes along, and we tried to do better planning. Produced plans in the 60s that laid out the MARTA system, the referendum MARTA system that we know today. And in 1965, the Georgia General Assembly created MARTA. Composed it of 5 counties, the same 5 counties that were in ARMPC, which Atlanta Region Metropolitan Planning Commission that succeeded MPC in 1960. In addition to Fulton and DeKalb, of course, were Cobb, Gwinnett, and Clayton. And those were the original members of MARTA as created by the General Assembly.
There were signs even then of increasing suburbanization, and as the years went by, downtown had a lesser and lesser share, in particular of retail, of the office market, and was a place in transition. So what's been really exciting is to see, even though downtown had gone downhill in some sectors of the economic activity, other sectors have really come on over the years, and to where we've seen a revitalization. And the fact that the city of Atlanta has come back as well in terms of population economic development has certainly helped downtown. So let me give you a couple of examples of what has happened and what is still happening. Downtown, the convention business has been a huge business. The World Congress Center, the fact that the state stepped up and invested in a major convention facility has been a dramatic driver of hotels and a lot of economic activity in downtown. So that's been a big deal. Obviously, the Woodruff Foundation has been critically important. They've supported our organization, Central Atlanta Progress, over the years, and of course, more recently, in a very visible fashion, they're pledging a huge amount of money to support Grady Hospital. But they've been supporters of planning. They've also funded the Midtown Alliance and some of their work to do planning in Midtown. They have, I mentioned CAP, of course, but they funded our Imagine Downtown effort to a large extent. Earlier, our Central Area Study was also in part funded by the Woodruff Foundation. So they've been great supporters, I think strategic supporters of business, nonprofit organizations to build the capacity of those organizations and then to support planning efforts that ultimately help important parts of our city. Certainly there are other organizations that have done a great job. I'll mention a few that Central Atlanta Progress actually had a role in starting. We've been a catalyst over the years, creating organizations and then spinning them off. So Trees Atlanta was an example of an organization that we started, and of course has done wonderful work over the years in building back the tree canopy that development or just neglect has let lie fallow. So that's been a great organization. We started the what is now the Atlanta Development Authority. That was originally I don't even remember the name of it now, but Joe Martin was actually the first president, and Joe Martin later became our president of Central Atlanta Progress Of course, he was also involved with the development of Underground Atlanta.
So I sent out my staff out into the wilderness out there, out of City Hall, to find out where the neighborhoods were. And we put together, we invented places that had never been known as a neighborhood. We really didn't use any standard idea of what a neighborhood is. We said any collection of people that had a commonality to it would be a neighborhood. And we came up with 177 neighborhoods. We put out this map. We had to find names. We had to go ask people, what do you call this area? What do you do this? And so forth. And we came up with these 177. Well, we tried that for a year, and obviously we couldn't serve 177 different cities. So we began to coagulate areas of the city of neighborhoods so that 5 or 6 or 7 areas would be put together under a neighborhood and called a neighborhood planning unit.
Atlanta has always been seen as one of the cities. I think one of the reasons it grows, there are a lot of people are attracted here. I just came back from the little trip, and most people have a very positive impression of this city, and blacks have moved here in great numbers because of that. So, you know, I think we're making progress. I don't think there's any question about that. I mean, I'm old enough to go back to the days when we had separate water fountains and all that kind of jazz. And my own daughter can't even appreciate it because it doesn't make sense. I mean, that there was a door for a white and a door for a black, you know, and all that kind of thing, sitting in the back of the bus. But, you know, it's still, the vestiges of the past are still here. There are people who are still grappling with acceptance and understanding.
Last plan in Buckhead had been probably in the 1950s, and Buckhead was obviously one of the growth areas for the city. Midtown hadn't really begun to emerge yet, but Buckhead was clearly one of the growth areas for the city. And again, the city had sort of abdicated its role in dealing with those commercial core issues. Out of the Buckhead Area Growth Management Plan, we, among other things, actually shifted the city's position on Georgia 400 to become supportive of Georgia 400, you know, within some fairly precise definitions of what that project should be and how transit should be incorporated. We developed a proposal for what is now the Buckhead Loop, and to fix the Buckhead Loop as a very firm boundary to Buckhead, but by the same token, have very high density, very high intensity mixed-use development at those transit stations in that area. And I think that indeed is what has held now for the 2 decades since then. You've got a good firm edge to what Buckhead is. Transit is becoming more and more important part of what's going on in Buckhead, and the walkability of Buckhead is improving. So I think those were some big issues that you know, moved city planning in somewhat of a different direction.
Well, I think a little bit of both. I think we're unique in terms of just getting out there and giving people a chance. When I started in this really gung-ho into the public involvement thing, it became very obvious and important that we need to include all levels of our population, all segments of the population. And I experienced a number of planners and governments who were not seeking every segment of the population out for input, and sometimes it was intentional. So I think in terms of how Atlanta has looked at it, Atlanta has been very intentional in seeking out every segment of the population, people of all races, the physically challenged, young people, and now moving toward kind of high-tech ways, and I think we're going to have to do that more. But there's never going to be a substitute for face-to-face conversation with people. We're not going to be able to turn it over to technology.
The problems of the South, the issues of race, the economic problems, the urban-rural concerns, Atlanta has always been forward-thinking. The rest of the state has had to kind of follow behind, and it's, I don't know to what extent that's still a concern, but I'm sure it exists to some extent in a state. But I think it seems to me that over time it's changing. It's getting less and less an issue. It's interesting that you mentioned gentrification. It's interesting how the whole process of people, in a sense, leaving the city because of issues of race, and sometimes now they're all coming back. So people are concerned about, what's happening in the city, and I think in the long run it'll all work out. But it's a little hard to tell how that's going to happen. I think again it's going to be leadership, progressive leadership.
The predecessor organization for the Atlanta Regional Commission was actually the first publicly funded regional planning agency in the country, created back in 1947. Regional planning in this country really took off a little later after World War II in the 50s and into the 60s. So we've been a leader in regional planning from the very beginning. As most people know, ARC was created in 1971, and that was a result of the fact that from 47 to 71, a number of other regional entities had been created. We had the Regional Planning Council, we had a Regional Transportation Planning Agency, we had a Healthcare Planning Agency, we had a Law Enforcement Agency. A lot of these things were based on federal funding formulas that came down to regions and were ultimately abolished in the Reagan years.
And by 1959, I was the planning director. It was pretty clear that the two counties of the metropolitan area really didn't cover the metropolitan area, even defined by the census. So we started a movement to expand it and created what's then known as the Atlanta Region Metropolitan Planning Commission. Two of the leading figures in that were Howard Minhinnick, who was then the head of the planning school at Georgia Tech. He and I wrote proposed legislation as to what this new organization would be to bring it up to date. Excuse me. And a guy named Charlie Emmerich, who was the chairman of DeKalb County Board of Commissioners, and a really good guy, really very good government type person. He was at the time the head of what was known as the Metropolitan Council of Chambers of Commerce, working through them and getting the support of the Georgia Municipal Association, county commissioners, and so on. We were able to get an act introduced. It wasn't opposed much by the governments. It was opposed largely by some of the consultants who were afraid that our technical assistants would be competing with them, and I just wasn't concerned about that. And it did pass. In 1947, when the General Assembly first passed the MPC Act, the two-county MPC Act, which had a lot of limitations, it was the first publicly supported and created intergovernmental, I'm trying to say it just right, regional planning commission. So there are a number of firsts in ARC's history.
The interstate system came out of a plan that was done by the ARC. MARTA came out of an ARC plan. The Metropolitan River Protection Act was one of the first plans that ARC proposed to protect the Chattahoochee River from development, and we imposed that voluntarily. In fact, had to sue DeKalb County in order to force DeKalb County to follow that regional plan of protecting the corridor. And then ultimately, it went to the legislature, and the legislature approved it. And now we have it as a state law that protects that 1,000-acre or 1,000-foot corridor buffer on either side of the Chattahoochee. And we've controlled that for all of these years. And if you fly over the Chattahoochee or you canoe down the Chattahoochee and you look at all the trees and green space and whatnot instead of great big houses, and you wonder why, it's because of the forethought of the folks that sat around an ARC table back in the early 1980s.
We were doing regional planning in a way that I don't think had ever really been done before at that scale. The planning district had increased to 5 counties and then 7 counties, which was a large increase over the original 2 counties plus the city of Atlanta that had been the case before. So there was a lot of new work to be done. Also, the Metropolitan River Protection Act was passed to protect the Chattahoochee River, and ARC was in the forefront of that. So it was a very exciting time from a policy level and also from the increase of scope of regional planning in the state.
In 1947, the Georgia General Assembly created the Metropolitan Planning Commission, and it operated until 1960 as a 2-county, Fulton and DeKalb, and the cities in those 2 counties, including Atlanta, of course, as the regional planning agency. Produced 2 regional plans during that period of time.
My most vivid recollection from back in the 70s was that ARC had a project called the Transit Station Area Development Studies. And this was an effort to take advantage of the coming transit system. You're right, ARC and its predecessors had been involved in some of the route planning for MARTA, and interestingly enough, many of the original routes that were set out were actually how MARTA was ultimately configured.
Then the next study we did was called Crosstown and Bypass Expressways. And these were pretty little modest studies when you look at them. And they took the future population projections and put them into cars and buses and put them on the freeways and found that an unbelievable number of lanes would be required just to move people in and out in a radial way. I learned a lesson on that. I think I had something like, in the year so-and-so, between 36 and 48 lanes would be required to handle access to the north. Well, my point was that that's absurd. I went home and was talking to a neighbor. He said, "Hey, I see on TV that you were saying that we're going to have to build 48 lanes. I don't see how we have room for that." So I came to learn that you have to make it clear that you're talking hypothetically. Anyway, those 2 studies clearly pointed out that a highway, freeway dominant system just wasn't going to cut it. Besides, there were new rapid transit systems growing up in San Francisco and other places. So we went ahead and we did a study called What You Should Know About Rapid Transit. And it was fairly elementary, simple thing. What is rapid transit? What is it not? But if I had to pick some things that I'm pleased, that I feel that I'm glad I did it. Ironically, most of them are institutional. They're not physical plans. They're not economic plans. One of them was the expansion of the 2-county MPC to the 5-county AR MPC, which I'm sure by the time Dan Sweat came in, it was probably out of date, but it wasn't when it was started. It got the regional planning effort from 1956 to 1971, I guess, something like that. So that was important. I know for a fact that there'd be no rapid transit system in Atlanta if the people who were were working on it hadn't done it.
We're also in an era of sort of the suburban explosion that we had at that point. The city was fairly troubled still. Major issues around schools that was contributing to decline in the city, and major expansions of the highway system that were still occurring. When ARC adopted its first regional transportation plan as ARC in mid-late 70s, there were some major policy decisions made at that point. The biggest one being to eliminate quite an extensive network of new roads, new highways, new interstate-type highways. I-485, 420, South Atlanta Tollway, Stone Mountain Freeway. All those were eliminated, and the policy decision, which seemed like a good policy decision at the time, was to eliminate these new facilities expand the existing facilities and concentrate on the expansion of transit. Well, what we did is we eliminated those facilities, we expanded the existing facilities, and to this day we still haven't completed the expansion of the transit system. So that's, I think, was one of our biggest failures that we had, and that probably contributed to our failure to see the kind of development we expected around the transit system. It just didn't get built very fast. Money's certainly an issue. It costs a lot of money to do that. But there were conscious choices that were made, I believe. There was a pretty sound choice made, as I mentioned before, to shift priorities away from construction of new roads toward getting the most out of the most that you can out of existing roads and expanding transit. That was a pretty smart choice to make, I think. But it was an easy choice to make as long as it just stayed in a regional plan. I think we didn't have the kind of, we had some tentative leadership. The fact that we did these transit feasibility studies was a pretty significant step. But I think what happened with the Furbach effort, the Cobb referendum effort, is indicative that you could get so far, but then when some of the real life issues raised their head, like the tension that existed around, I mean, frankly, racial tension that existed around the fare increase, that was what stopped it cold.
The real coup was when the Bell Aircraft Corporation decided to build what we now know as Lockheed, and the city of Atlanta had to run a water line from downtown up to Smyrna, Marietta, so they could have water to build the plant. The intergovernmental cooperation, the feeling that we're all in this together, I think was established with that war mentality. And they began to see that in order to maintain this and make it something that could continue, we had to plan for that future. And that's when modern planning in Atlanta really started. In 1946, the first transportation plan, first regional transportation plan for this area was produced. And it basically laid out the basis of the freeway system as we know it today, the downtown connector, 75, 85, and it talked about a future road to Augusta. They didn't talk about going to Birmingham, so I don't know what the problem was there.
When I came back to Atlanta in 1999 after leaving in the summer of 96, right after the Olympics, there was a tremendous resurgence in in-town living. I don't know what there was probably several factors at play. One was just the fact of the Olympics. People came downtown, they saw in-town neighborhoods, maybe they drove in and parked their car in Decatur or Inman Park and rode in on MARTA, and realized, hey, this is not bad, and if we lived here, I could be at work a lot sooner. So I think there was some of that. I think just the attention that it got on the world stage caused people who were thinking about where do I want to live and work decide on Atlanta. And you look at the in-migration of people to the region. A lot of them are coming from New York and northeastern areas where living close and living in fairly dense quarters is the norm. So I think there's been a transformation sort of in the mindset of the average citizen. Clearly, transportation and congestion, mobility issues have played a role in that as well. I'm a lawyer. my time is worth, hundreds of dollars an hour. If I'm living in far north Forsyth County and am driving to work and, not multitasking and sending emails and talking to clients on the phone the whole way, then, that's hundreds of, maybe thousands of dollars a day, depending upon how long the commute is, that I'm not, I'm not reaping the benefits of.
When I mentioned a few minutes ago about having taken a volunteer group, our business group, out to see a community, and that community was Smyrna. I am very, very impressed with how that community intentionally decided to repurpose and revitalize their community, and it didn't take a whole lot of time. It wasn't a 30-year plan that they implemented. They were intentional about planning their kind of downtown mixed use, where the public was going to invest in that infrastructure as well. So they intentionally put their city hall and government center there around all of these businesses, and made it walkable and scalable so that people could get around. But it only took them a few years, I would say 10 years at the most. Of course, they're still burgeoning, but I wanted to show that community just how that it can be done, and they did an excellent job. The other community that has really come into its own is the city of Decatur. I'm very impressed with how it has revitalized, and once again, it's because the leadership has been intentional about moving forward and turning the city around and taking advantage of, instead of letting the some of the things that they looked at 25 years ago as being negative, turning around and using it to their advantage. Now, it has taken them 25 years, but that's okay. At some point, somebody was intentional about planning for that city. And so now it's happening quickly, and people are able to really touch and feel Decatur and how it's come into its own. I think those are two good examples in the region.
So things moved rather quickly, from plan to financing to construction, to get things moving. At the same time, Mayor Hartsfield was lobbying Congress like crazy to authorize the construction of Beaufort Dam, because he had seen the need with running the water line up to serve Bell Aircraft, that the Chattahoochee River by itself wasn't going to be able to handle things. So he was lobbying Congress in the late 40s for authorization of Beaufort Dam and construction, and ultimately Lake Lanier for our water supply.
How rapid transit would shape the region was the name of it. And that's when we began the TSADS program, which I had gone up to Washington and talked to a person at, I think it was, I can't remember what UMT had been established at the time, but they gave us $1.5 million to begin doing station area planning called TSADS, the transit station. It may be remembered that we had a rubber tire system that replaced it, and that is the trackless trolley. It lasted for maybe 6 years or so. But at that was a time when we began to suburbanize. And transit doesn't work without density. And that's why the Peachtree streetcar could be built today, particularly starting with the connection from Midtown to downtown, and the downtown loop system and that type of thing. But unless we start dealing with getting people close to their destination, they're not going to get out of their car.
I know that while I was gone to Washington for 6 years, and we had left this rapid transit planning process bubbling along, remember Leon came along and he looked at them and he noticed that some of these proposed lines didn't go through the middle of communities like West End or Decatur. And frankly, we were looking at the bottom line of costs, so we were keeping them along the railroad lines. But he argued that they should be swerved out into the middle of Decatur and into the middle of West End to serve as nodes. And I think he was right. I just, there's things change as you go along. In the 1961 plan, we were still showing freeways through neighborhoods which were viewed as disgusting 5 years later. You don't do that. So.
But the transit station area development studies, the idea was to take the leverage of having a new major piece of infrastructure coming in place and trying to do planning for around the station areas. And at the time, that was pretty innovative. And I think that we probably were more successful for those stations that had some real development potential as opposed to the ones that were surrounded by neighborhoods where it was really unrealistic to assume that a lot was going to happen there over the short run. Some of the work was quite good, and I think did have an effect on what ultimately happened in terms of redevelopment of some areas or development of other areas. I've spent most of my career in downtown, but I did have about 3 years in Gwinnett County. So Gwinnett at the time was, I liked the vision of Gwinnett at the time having suburbanism lapping at its shores. It had happened in the Norcross area, and it was coming to Lilburn, and it was just then in the early stages of coming to Lawrenceville. And of course now it's washed over past Gwinnett County. But yeah, suburbanization has been an interesting phenomenon here. We've certainly done it as big as any metro area in the country, no doubt about that. One side note there, when I first came to be planning director in Gwinnett, I spent a lot of time driving around the county on zoning rides and that type of thing. And my observation to people was that I thought the whole county was for sale. Virtually every piece of property would have a for sale sign on it. I'd never seen anything like it before. And one day I was at Manuel's, and I was talking to Manuel Malouf, who's undoubtedly many of the folks you're going to interview will talk about Manuel Malouf and his role, both as chairman of the Atlanta Regional Commission, as head of DeKalb County's government. But he was a great observer of politics and of suburbanization and a lot of things.
Frankly, at the time, I think there was real reluctance in many places to tie into the MARTA system. My guess is it had to do with a whole set of racial and social views about what MARTA was going to be and what that might cause. And a perfect example would be at the Lenox transit station. Incredible lost opportunity to tie the Lenox transit station into the only regional shopping center that MARTA served up to that point. And it was it not only didn't happen, but sort of aggressively didn't happen. The connection even to this day is not very good between the MARTA Lenox station and Lenox Square. And that's interesting because that station basically took one of the only African American communities on the north side of town, the Johnsontown community, which was located sort of down in the gully there at the site of the station. It was basically completely displaced, and as was a black community a little bit further south along the line that was also displaced, and yet so we lost these African American communities there, and there was a failure, I think, to link into the MARTA system, I believe to some extent because of those kind of racial and social pressures.
Georgia did at one time have a fairly detailed planning enabling act, but through a series of constitutional amendments and all of that over the course of a number of years has really devolved to sort of a tension, I guess, between home rule, which is essentially local self-governance, and some degree of state, with some degree of state oversight. Back when the Planning Act, the Georgia Planning Act was passed in the 80s, there was, or early 90s, I guess, that was really the first time in my career where the state really took an active interest, or appeared to take an active interest in planning. And what the Planning Act really did, from my perspective, is sort of just put everything together that local governments could already do under home rule, but said, we'd like you to do this under sort of a state umbrella with some degree of state oversight. The Planning Act said local governments can hire planning and zoning staff. Well, they could already do that. It said they had to participate in a regional development center. And as you know, being at ARC, sometimes that participation is active and they're really into it, and other times it's sort of reluctant participation. So it said local governments had to do a certain number of things, or had the authority to do a number of things. As I said, the Planning Enabling Act, the statewide Planning Enabling Act of, I believe it was 1957, sort of was cast by the wayside as a result of some constitutional amendments. And the constitutional authority now for planning and zoning in Georgia is very, very succinct, and it doesn't say much beyond local governments may plan and zone. It does say that the General Assembly does have the ability to pass procedural laws for overseeing, or for the local governments have to follow during planning and zoning actions. So what you have now is a lot of local authority with some very limited state oversight having to do strictly with procedure. You have the zoning procedures law, which essentially says if you're going to change the zoning on a piece of property, you have to provide notice within a certain period of time. It says that you have to post a sign on the property. It says that you have to have standards for making a decision. It doesn't say what those standards have to be, but it says you have to have standards. So there's very limited framework at the state level for planning and zoning decision making in the state of Georgia. So it really devolves down to the local governments. And in the state of Georgia, which has 159 counties, there are about 50 counties in the state that don't have zoning. Some of them have some degree of development regulations, or they might have specific regulations having to do with the placement of telecommunications towers, for instance, or waste facilities, those sorts of things.
I feel very strongly about local government and its role, but one of the things Governor Harris did was he put together a Growth Strategies Commission. And if you go back to his speeches that he gave, he spoke about it 25 or 30 times in major addresses where he talked about that. But that was a broad-based group. He appointed Joel Cowan, a college classmate of his, roommate, to chair that group, and John Sibley was brought in, and John was executive director of that group. And there's a broad-based group of business leaders and government leaders that spent a couple of years working on that in task forces. And I don't know how many meetings, I think it's 70, 80 meetings held around the state before they came up with their specific recommendations on what should be done. But in 1998, the governor talked about it in his State of the State, and then legislation was presented and that implemented the growth strategies in 1989.
We're going to be forced to deal with the need for transit outside of our region, and unfortunately, transit, believe it or not, is still looked down upon by a lot of people in this region. When you go out and talk to people about riding the bus or riding the train or just using public transportation, there are still a lot of negative or actually kind of misinformed perceptions about transit out there. So here goes with the education again. We've got to educate our decision makers along with our public about the need for transportation and transit investment in the community that should have occurred a long, long time ago.
Instead of just another sleepy southern town like Birmingham or Chattanooga or Nashville at the time, people began to see that there was some real possibilities here. I think some of it started with Mr. Woodruff saying that every soldier ought to have, regardless of where they were in the world, have access to a daily Coca-Cola. And that carried Atlanta's name around the world. Soldiers came here, recruits from all over the United States or around to the South to be trained.
You know, it was fascinating looking back over the information that I've talked about today. I think it was in 1986, Governor Harris laid out the plan to drought-proof the state. You know, this drought that we're in has created terrible problems, and we've got to move forward with drought-proofing the state. I remember traveling the state with Leonard Ledbetter, who was head of EPD at the time. They developed a great plan, you know, and we went all over the state, all over North Georgia. You know, had breakfasts and lunches with people, and everybody said, yeah, that's a good idea. And then it started raining, and, you know, well, it's an expensive proposition, and it's raining. We don't have a drought. We get 52 inches of water a year. You know, why do we want to worry about something like that? So, you know, it fell off. And regrettably, that's what we do in a number of areas. But we face some big challenges, though. I think when you talk about transportation, I think you can't overlook health care. I think you can't overlook the whole the growth dynamic that's taking place. I was looking at some maps this morning of the projected growth. You all have some excellent data on projected growth of the metropolitan area.
Forsyth Street had a wooden bridge back in the late actually they had a wooden bridge before the Civil War. I assumed it disappeared under that event. But they began to slowly build bridges before World War I over Spring and Forsyth, Central Avenue, Alabama, all began to build these viaducts. And of course, they then began to want to connect the viaducts. And one of the big issues was to build a plaza over the railroads that would link the viaducts. And everybody thought it was a good idea until the business people said, no, we don't want people to be sleeping out in front of our stores or on the benches that you put out there. They didn't like the idea. The railroads didn't like the idea. The state didn't like the idea. And so it wasn't until after World War I until we began to see several of these built and connected, actually, and to over what is now underground Atlanta. But the first official board that was set up by the city was in 1921. And it was kind of interesting because of what they dealt with, zoning having grown up out of the 1926 Euclid versus Amber Realty, which I'm sure you studied. But even more important was the funding of the Great Society period, the building of the expressways, the FHA loans. I bought my house in '62. In an old part of Atlanta, I couldn't get a loan. I could get a 95, 98% loan in the suburbs. I couldn't even get a loan in Ansley Park. And so there were a lot of factors that caused the region to add 1.5 million people in this period of '70s and '80s, whereas the Atlanta lost 100,000 of its population, 14% of its population vanished. So the plan became the leading element of how we were to grow in the future. I'll mention one more thing, why this is important. When we, in September of 1990, the city was awarded the privilege of hosting the '96 Summer Olympic Games. This is one of the reasons I got a call 2 weeks later from Maynard asking me to come back to the city and do planning, do development, but also to prepare the city for the Olympics and so forth. And so by the beginning of '91, I went home for 3 days and wrote up what I thought we should do. We wanted to do two things. We wanted to make the city more attractive for the people and more efficient for the people who were coming to the games. This is in '91, and actually the end of '91. And secondly, we had gone through the comprehensive planning process so many times. We had a pretty good view of what we thought the future ought to be about. And so we wanted the games also to be on a track to help us deliver that long-term city. Those were the two overriding interests of putting this plan together. Maynard then took the plan to the International Olympic Committee meeting just before the Barcelona Olympics in '92 and presented our plan for what we were going to do to prepare the city for the Olympics. No city had ever done that before. And so they were very laudatory, except it wasn't also written in French. They were upset about that. But then we began to put together the mechanism when Maynard came out that to create the Corporation for Olympic Development in Atlanta to implement that plan. They enormously enlarged it so that we ended up by spending publicly, privately, by the city, $500 million on the improvements to be made to the city in time for the Olympics. No one has ever actually toted up there except the person who was head of the Corporation for Olympic Development, Claire Axum, and her planner, who was Randy Rourke.
And then, of course, with our first African mayor, Maynard Jackson, he had a towering intellect, had a dramatic capability to speak to people at all levels. He was the kind of guy who came into, like a meeting of the Atlanta Regional Commission. Invariably, he was late, but he would come in and the room would light up. This was a guy who was the center of attention. I loved one of his remarks. He said he's large and in charge, but he was the kind of guy who, he was literally the center of attention just by, it wasn't just his physical presence, it was his intellect too, and his ability to speak. His grandfather was John Wesley Dobbs, and he was considered to be the mayor of Auburn Avenue, and he through genetically, I think, just acquired some of his ability to speak to people. He was a great orator. And even though ARC did not have they created a position for Maynard Jackson to be on the executive committee. He was the parliamentarian for ARC, a position that did not exist before then, because I think the leadership of ARC at the time realized they needed to have more African American involvement in the organization and in a leadership position. And he used that position to great advantage. I mean, on occasion, I can still hear him to this day saying, respectfully, let me give you my opinion on what ought to be done. And he really knew parliamentary procedure, but whenever you heard the word respectfully, you knew, this was going to be serious. He just had a way of commanding the room. So Maynard Jackson, we were fortunate to have him. Now, he was a confrontational person. He was probably the right person who knew what he wanted. He insisted on partnerships, joint ventures. That became to be kind of a term of that was a real kind of a flashpoint in the community, because what he insisted on was essentially minority involvement in contracting. So the airport was delayed at least a year, the new terminal, because Maynard Jackson insisted upon a certain level of minority involvement out there. Some of the early political leaders were folks like Ernest Barrett, who was chair of Cobb County Commission, longtime chair, ARC's first chair, and I think Ernest probably was chair almost during my whole first period at ARC. I thought a really forward thinker in terms of his ability to articulate what a region was about, and he had a good, I thought, a soothing way about him that led a lot of people to have confidence in what a regional organization can do. After Ernest, I didn't really know many, at least as an ARC employee, I didn't know many of the subsequent chairs, but there were some who were pretty significant. Manuel Maloof was obviously an influential, crusty guy who was a pretty plain-spoken fellow, and very, but I think really sincere in his view that regional organization was necessary, and was a real supporter of what ARC about what ARC did. I mean, there's some other significant staff folks who have been, I think, important to ARC. Joel Stone was a longtime director of transportation with ARC, later head of comprehensive planning, and probably one of the most influential people in terms of ARC's transportation planning directions that we've had.
It's going to require thoughtful planning on the part of our leaders, and just having the resources doesn't guarantee that it's going to be used correctly if you don't have good plans. So, going back to our earlier conversation, I would hope that the work that this commission does, as well as the city working together, and then with the resources, we can improve our infrastructure, and we have a great city. It's a regional city. It's more and more becoming a national city. It's becoming an international city with the merger of these two large airlines. I think the value of the model, of the community action model, was it said, let's sit down and talk and see what's good for our community. And no one has a perfect answer. It's often a need of blending some of the things that you want and some of the things that we want. The model of community action, of people sitting down and seeing the advantages of better housing or whatever it is, or transportation, or I don't know that anybody has the right answer, but people have the right answer if they work together. And they'll figure it out by sitting down and talking together.